It's a combination, I think, of bringing expertise, bringing experience that's real. If you've been, for example, working on better prosecuting violence against women cases for 40 years, you are going to have information and expertise that somebody who's never done that doesn't. So you take that body of knowledge with the leadership of the women's human rights NGOs on the ground and you combine them. That's honestly the best way that I can put it. And each is essential because without the leadership and insight and just relationships, practical things like that of the women who are leading the effort on the ground, who have the passion, who have the whether it's the organizational support or it's a new grant or something like that, if they have that passion and they're willing to work on this and guide you in the cultural context, the power of those two things coming together across borders is what makes things work. It's not that different when you work across, state lines in some ways in the United States, or, you think about the difference between even the response rate of let's just say Minneapolis police again to domestic violence and sexual assault and the difference between that and Duluth. Well, yes, there are wonderful, Duluth is a historic, as you know, place for effective reform on violence against women, but and there are just fantastic, wonderful, creative people that have been working on excellent solutions for years. So you take that, but you know that Minneapolis is a massive metropolitan area that's got big immigration populations and diverse populations, and you it all has to be adapted and just open for new solutions. The last year has been devastating for women in many ways. Violence against women, where we've been able to collect statistics and understand it, the increase and the nature of it, both have been reported to be catastrophic. I think about, for example, some police I was talking with in a developed part of the world, and while they didn't have the statistic that showed it was on the rise, what they saw was increasingly brutal and severe kinds of assaults, indicating to them that there was a sense that that an abuser could act that way with impunity, in a way that there wasn't before, but also things like child marriage is on the rise. Women isolated in their homes, just generally, women and girls isolated in their homes. Home is not a safe place for so many women and girls, and to think that that would keep and girls safe. Those of us who worked in the field, we knew immediately that this was going to be um, tragic. Southeast Asia, the shelter workers were not, many of the places we're in contact with, they weren't labeled essential services workers, so the shelters closed. India, Southeast Asia. So all those things, the isolation of women in their homes, I think is just generally not understood. The danger of that is not understood. Yeah, well, just with regard to the term toxic masculinity, I think of the socialization that men and boys go through to identify their masculinity with power and control. And that has gone awry, I would say, generally speaking, in our world. That if we're going to identify, your masculinity, your kind of identity, with power and control, and feel like you aren't as valuable in your masculinity or your identity without that, then that's going to lead to the kind of abuse we see of people that they feel entitled to control, and that's what's happening. happened, and that continues. And so, I don't think masculinity necessarily has to be toxic. I've had that conversation with men too. What do you mean masculinity is toxic? That's not what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But I would say that, again, huge generalizations, but I guess I get to make them after 30 years running around the world this way. So I'll do that. So what is still very, very prevalent is that identification of your masculinity as tied so closely to the power and control that you have. And we've seen that, as I come back to that comment I made earlier about authoritarian leaders, that is very much what we saw in our own country. Just and the dismissal of the subjugated populations like Donald Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi and all these leaders of really large countries. um, that that leadership matters. That leadership matters. People follow leaders.
Mhm.
They follow leaders. They listen to what they say. They're emboldened by some feeling they might have of their own, or they, if a leader is questioning that, I believe that there's going to be a different kind of culture created. Aspects of culture created by leaders. They've done that. I think there's an accountability on that those leaders uh, have for the world that's been created over the last 4 to 5 years. I think we were on a path, honestly, before that. Just one example I think of is the US embassies were oftentimes supporting our work in all over the world. Uh, Staff was focused on police reform, on violence against women, and training prosecutors and supporting the local NGOs. That just completely went away. We didn't have any support from US embassies. It was a big financial hit that we took, when the the messaging in the United States changed. And I'll also just say the messaging in the United States has a powerful impact all over the world. People watch us.
Mm.
People watch us, and they watch what our leaders do. We set the tone for a lot of viewpoints and approaches. We have a direct service program called Pathways to Family Peace, where we're working with men who have been convicted of domestic assault and ordered to batters intervention programs. Our program is aimed at taking responsibility for violent behavior and accountability and behavior change. So we don't work directly with victims of violence in healing their trauma at this point, Mickey, but this direct service work that we're doing is very much about that. I We were in direct contact with any victim whose perpetrator is part of our program. We're working with her about to make sure whatever we're doing, of course, do no harm, is not endangering her further. That we're getting her story in addition to the perpetrator's story, because oftentimes perpetrators won't be truthful, and we have to address that. The guiding principle that we are really dedicated, increasingly to in all of our work on legal and systemic reform is beginning anything with a listening focus group with victims. So there's really nothing we do anymore without sitting down and talking with victim survivors who are in the system that we are uh, pondering a reform to. We want to hear from them, and that is also, I think, a healing approach. I mean, it's a respect. Anything that's respectful, I think, contributes to healing, and I think that's something that hasn't been done enough in the work on violence against women. Is certainly recently. When we first started this work back in the 70s, it was all about victims leading the way, so their voices were at the forefront. But as we became, at least in this country, more institutionalized with our work on violence against women, sometimes we have been leaving that out and thinking about, okay, if we're going to work on a new policy with the judicial system, well, we're going to talk to judges and prosecutors. Well, we're going to talk to judges and prosecutors, of course, but the first thing we're going to do is talk to victims. So we have a newsletter. Sign up for our newsletter at Global Rights for Women. We have some wonderful, long-standing direct service providers all over Minnesota, Violence Free Minnesota, Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. There's a human sex trafficking task force. So if the local work is what people are interested, the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Violence Free Minnesota and others just did a fabulous job at the legislature last year. And that people can do that. They can be involved in knowing what our legislators are considering, what they might be putting up obstacles to. That occurs at the state level, it occurs at the federal level. President Biden is going to be a force. If our country will let him, he will be a force on addressing violence against women, both in our country and globally.